Start? I think so. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us in this session. I'm Arash Naragi, professor of philosophy and religion at Moravian College in Pennsylvania. I am presiding this panel on behalf of my friend, Professor Forough Jahanbakhsh. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here with us due to her illness. So we are happy to have two distinguished scholars as our panelists, Professor Abdul Karim Soroush and Professor Andrew Rippin. This panel is a conversation and discussion with Dr. Abdul Karim Soroush, the eminent Iranian religious thinker and reformer, based on his latest book, The Expansion of Prophetic Experience, Essays on Historicity, Contingency, and Plurality in Religion. Dr. Soroush has been known for his epistemological theory of religion known as the contraction and expansion of religious knowledge and its application to Islamic democratic political theory and religious pluralism. His previous book, Reason, Freedom, and Democracy in Islam, applies this theory to plurality and historicity of understanding and interpretation of religion, and his new book, The Expansion of Prophetic Experience, presents some of his original theories about the fluidity of religion itself. This book, the latest book, treats the historicity of Prophet Muhammad's revelatory experience, including human and contextual influences on the nature of revelation and the genesis of the sacred text. Of course, the implication of this theory are enormous, not only for Islamic theology and jurisprudence, but for reform in general. This book, as you might expect, has been highly controversial. Our other panelist, Professor Andrew Rippin, is a professor of history and former dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Victoria. He received his PhD from McGill University with a dissertation on the Quranic occasions of revelation material. His research into the formative period of Islamic civilization in the Arab world, as well as the history of the Quran and its interpretation, has resulted in numerous publications, a selection of which are collected in his book, The Quran and its Interpretative Tradition, published in 2001. He is also the author of The Muslims, Their Religious Beliefs and Practices, first published in 2 volumes in 1990 and 1993, and now combined into a single volume in its 4th edition, published in August of 2011. He has edited a number of books, including the Blackwell Companion to the Quran, Defining Islam, The Islamic World, and Islam in the Eyes of the West. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2006. So, to start the panel, I would like to ask Professor Soroush to open the discussion by presenting some overview of the major themes he discussed in his latest book, and more specifically about his theory about the nature of revelation. And then I would ask the Professor Rippin to share his comments and questions, and then we will open the floor to the audience. Professor Soroush, please.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Naragi and Professor Rippin, who has taken the burden of making valuable comments to what I am going to share with you here about my recently published book. I need to present you with a very brief historical account of the genesis and the birth of this book, and then I will go on to discuss some of the main points, main controversial points in the book, and maybe some implications of the theory that I expand in the book. The title of the book speaks for itself, The Expansion of Prophetic Experience, by which I mainly mean that prophethood is generalizable. And although there have been some people who are named as prophets and they have started and established well-known religions, nevertheless, prophethood or perhaps revelation is not and cannot be confined to them. It is generalizable, and even within the religious discourse, we can establish this point. It might seem, heretical or perhaps unorthodox to say that, but as we go on, we will see that there are good grounds for such an idea, to the extent that every day and in every generation we can have religious experience, we can have revelation, and we can have, if you like, little prophets in every age, with or without missions. Now, as the brief historical account, I would like to just bring to your attention that some 10 years before I write and publish this book, this recent one, which appeared in 2009 by Brill Publication, I published another book under the title The Expansion and Contraction of Religious Knowledge. That was a collection of a number of essays that I had previously published in some of the intellectual journals in Iran, and then I decided to collect them in a book form and publish them. It proved to be very controversial in Iran, and some 13 books, apart from numerous articles, critical articles, some 13 books had been written about the book, criticizing the content and discussing the ideas put forward there. The main idea, the main point in that book was to prove and to argue for the historicity of religious knowledge. By historicity, I will come later and will tell you what I mean, which is very close and very familiar with the historicity in the modern jargon. But religious knowledge, I meant a collective knowledge which is based on our understanding of scriptures. There actually I made a separation, a distinction between two things, religion on the one hand and understanding of religion on the other. And I argued that although in the eyes and minds of religious people, religion is sacred, religion is heavenly, religion is without contradiction, religion is salvific, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, none of these characteristics, none of these attributes can be assigned to religious knowledge. Our understanding of religion is neither heavenly nor free from contradictions. And therefore, making a distinction between the two will help us to settle some of the controversies and some of the arguments and counter-arguments which are going on and have been going on among theologians and philosophers of religion. Most of the time, people, despite the simplicity of this distinction, some people usually miss it and overlook it and do not take it seriously into consideration, and because of that fall into the trap of some fallacies. I take this point from philosophy of science, from modern epistemology, which tells us that we have to be always on guard, not to make a mix-up between what we think and what there is there in the world. And I argued there that always when a new theory of religion or new interpretation comes up, it is against another interpretation in the past. It doesn't mean never an interpretation confronts the book itself. Always interpretations fight against each other. So to speak, we are immersed in an ocean of interpretations. And the moment that you offer a new interpretation, you should not think that your interpretation would debunk other interpretation. You have only added to the bank of interpretations. If we had so far, let us say, 70 interpretations of the book or of the text, by your presentation, it will become 71. Never think that you will end, the process of interpretation. Never think that yours will be the last one. As I put it in my book, Expansion and Contraction of Religious Knowledge, according to the Muslim belief, the last prophet has come, but the last interpreter of his book has not yet come. And there will be no last or final interpreter of the book. It is an ongoing process. It is an ongoing endeavor. And it has been always the case in the past, and it is so natural for a text to be interpreted in different ways. And the distinction between the heretical and non-heretical ones is always a very murky one. And it's always a subject of power to say who is heretical, whose is heretical, and whose is not heretical. And knowledge is a collective thing, and always we have a plethora and plenty of such interpretations. So anyway, my main argument in that book tried to show, to demonstrate the historicity, fluidity of, and plurality of religious interpretations, religious understanding, as a quite a natural way of doing things. I made and I put forward a number of examples, historical examples, in order to prove that. Of course, I should say that I had a political goal in my mind as well. I come from Iran, and I take it that everybody here is familiar with Iran and its political situation and the dictatorship and all that which is going on there. And through the theory of expansion and contraction of religious knowledge, one of the implications that I had in mind was to offer a plurality of interpretations, i.e. to say that the government, the state, which has based itself on a single interpretation of religion, that single interpretation is not valid. And you cannot force people into a particular interpretation. Religious text is always subject to different interpretations, and it is the right of the religious people to have their own interpretations, to offer it, and even to contradict the official interpretation. In a word, I argued that there can be no official interpretation of religion. An official interpretation of religion is actually the heart and the essence of religion and state being one and the same. And the separation of religion and state, if somebody likes it, actually is based on the idea of impossibility of an invalidity of an official interpretation of religion and accepting the plurality thereof. So anyway, that was the main idea in my book. Some 10 years later, as I mentioned, I came to realize that not only religious knowledge or understanding of religious texts and scriptures are historical, are contingent upon social and historical conditions, but the religion itself and the revelation itself is historical, is contingent upon social and historical situation. This even, of course, looked more heretical, more unorthodox. And I had to, first of all, pay much more attention to my critics and pay much more cost, of course, in order to argue for that. Now, all these arguments and different papers and articles, I collected them in the book. Here you see it. And before this it was in Persian, and now you have it in English. Unfortunately, the one before, the expansion and contraction, has not yet been translated into English. But for those of you who can read Arabic, there is a good translation that I edited it myself. In Arabic, you can find it. It is published in Lebanon. Here in this book, actually, I argue for the contingency, historicality, or historicity of revelation of prophethood itself. And as I mentioned, and I alluded to, it means a kind of generalization of prophethood. And by generalization, I mean that everybody virtually and potentially can become a prophet. And prophets were no exceptions. They had the same potentiality, but they actualized it. And if you like, you can also actualize it. But of course, there are different prophets, prophets with mission, prophets without mission, and that's a different issue, which I'm not going to go into it. I mainly look at it from the epistemological point of view. Now, an important point here I would like to make is that for the students, the Western students of religion and Orientalists, of course, they have argued for the historicity of religion and understanding of religion for decades now. And my position is somehow close to them, but there are differences, which I have to make absolutely clear. What are the differences? The differences are in presuppositions and in the method I adopt. The Western Orientalist methodology of approaching religion and coming to the conclusion that perhaps revelation religion is historical is mainly empirical. Empirical in the sense that they look at the environment of the Prophet. They look at, let us say, in the case of Islam, in this Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. They look at the history of the life of Prophet and so on and so forth. And through this, they come to the conclusion that perhaps Islam, like any other religion, any other ideology for that matter, is a historical thing. I do not deny none of this. But one of the presuppositions of mainly of Orientalists is that they do not believe in the prophethood of the Prophet. And they think that without such a belief, they are even more objective in their study. They can study it, religion much better than the people who are, already committed to a particular religion. There might be some exceptions, but this is, a dominant view that detachment means objectivity. And if you detach yourself, from the faith point of view, from the belief point of view, from a particular religion, if you do not enter a love affair with the prophet of a particular religion, then you can be more objective about him. I personally sometimes put it this way, that religion, and this is my belief, of course, that religion is too important to be left to lovers alone. Religion is too important to be left to religious people alone. Of course, we need non-lovers. We need non-religious people and non-believers to put forward their ideas and to tell us about their criticism, about their views about their religion. But nevertheless, you can be objective and you can be a faithful person. You can be a believer at the same time, a good and objective student of religion. Anyway, if there are students of religion who think that detachment means objectivity, that is not my belief. I think that attachment can be combined with objectivity. You can look at criticism very objectively, you can take them, you can discuss them, and you can, of course, argue for your belief. So that is my departure, my departing point. I come from within a believer's community, and I not only believe in Prophet Muhammad himself, but I love him. And therefore, what I say, although might seem a little bit detached and not, suitable for a lover, but nevertheless, I can distance myself from my love, and for the time being, I can discuss the things perhaps more objectively. Now, as to the method, my method is again different, and to some extent, I must confess it's archaic, it's metaphysical. I am not, denying, the historical way of doing things. It has got its own respect and its validity, no doubt about it, and I use the same method sometimes. But mine is very different. Since I believe in the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad, I have to have a minimal metaphysics. Without that minimal metaphysical ideas, I cannot, enter the world of prophethood and the world of belief. At least I have to believe in some sort of revelation, the possibility of revelation, the possibility of God disclosing himself to human beings, the possibility of having access to God in order perhaps, quote unquote, to hear his voice and to convey it to other people. My metaphysics, as I will go on, I will show, is quite minimal. I don't have the same metaphysics as Ibn Sina, as Al-Farabi, although I have taken a lot from them, but I have been very careful to minimize it in order to make it as defensible as possible, as arguable as possible, and as usable as possible. So that is my main, approach and my minimal metaphysics. Although it is not part of what I am going to discuss here, but just I tell you in brackets that one of the articles in the book is about the maximality or minimality of religion. And there actually I say that my mission perhaps is to minimize, or if you like, to trim religion rather than to fatten it. Because it is, again, a distinction I usually make between different reformers. There are reformers who argue for a maximalist view of religion and religiosity, and there are reformers who argue for a minimalist view of religion and religiosity. I am in the second category, and I think in order for the religion to be adaptable to the modern world and to be a receiver of modern ideas, we have to trim religion and we have to give it its proper place, not to trespass its boundaries and not to claim too much. And this I have taken it from Kant, the German philosopher, who said a maximalist God means no God. If you fatten God, nobody will worship him. You have to trim, the qualities and attributes of God in order to make it accessible and lovable. An overwhelming God which, reduce you to nothing and to zero is not a God which you can love him, you can worship him. In order for a God to be worshipable, must be accessible. So that is the thing that I also observe it in the case of religion, and I argue for a minimalist view of religion. I have a minimalist, minimal metaphysics as well. Now, in my metaphysics, there are only two persons, God and prophet. And although I base my argument mainly on classical philosophers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, but I do not buy their, philosophy about active intellect and things like that. So it was, something which fitted the classical cosmology, and I do not need actually to borrow these ideas from them and to base my argument. I can, work within a much limited metaphysics, and I can hammer home my ideas. I have got two main principles to build the edifice that I am going to build and to contrast. Now, the first, which seems almost tautological, is this: everything in nature is natural. This is a self-evident truth, I would like. It is almost a tautology, as I said. Everything in the world of nature is natural, is naturalized. Despite its simplicity, it contains a very lofty and opulent fact. It is a very important principle. Look, again, in the classical jargon, according to classical philosophers and theologians, including Muslim theologians and Christian and Jewish ones, we are not only flesh, we are a combination of soul or spirit and flesh. Now, supposedly, soul comes from a supernatural world, and the flesh, the body, is from clay, from the earth, from the natural stuff. And we are a combination of the two. But, and this is a very big but soul becomes embodied. The embodiment of the soul is important. It becomes naturalized. We are not pure souls. And our souls, if there are any, they can work through our body. They are tailored to our body. And we are, the access and the contact between and among human beings is through their bodies. Therefore, in the natural world, maybe in the world of angels, you have got pure souls. But in this natural world, even soul is naturalized, has become with body, has become incarnated, if you like. So this is the first principle, which nothing in the natural world can be supernatural. Everything in the natural world is naturalized, even if it comes from the supernatural world. It has got to become natural in order to be able to step in the natural world. So this is the gist of the first principle. Now the second principle, which again I have taken it from Muslim philosophers, these principles I've taken from them, but I have applied them to a case which they had not applied. So this is the difference. Perhaps I was clever enough to generalize their principles and to find a new application for their principles. Now you judge. The second principle is that whatever happens in the natural world is conditioned by time and matter. This has got a very well-known formula in Arabic, in Aristotelian philosophy. Ibn Sina makes a lot of this principle. Sadruddin Shirazi discussed it in length. And I have not seen anybody of other Muslim philosophers who have, argued against it, who have rejected it. Everything in the world of matter, in the material world, is preceded by time and matter, or is conditioned by time and matter. This is how they formulated it. Of course, in a modern jargon, we can put it, in a much clearer way, but that is exactly the translation of the principle that they have argued for. كل حادث مسبوق بمادة ومدة. This is exactly the Arabic formula of the principle. Now, if these two principles are taken together, I think my minimal metaphysics is, virtually complete. And I need no further principle. I am a British empiricist, or at least being trained in their, school. And I stick very firmly to Occam razor. Occam razor, you remember it from the British empiricism. Entities are not to be multiplied without necessity. This is Occam razor, and this is one of the finest principles of empiricism. And I think everybody must stick to it, so long as he would like to be, on a defensible ground. Because so long as you expand your ground or your field of metaphysical presuppositions, you have to bring in, a lot of ammunition in order to defend your position. And that is not a wise, course of action. So anyway, my metaphysics now is virtually complete. Two principles now, and these two principles I am not going to argue or perhaps to demonstrate, to bring and to offer any syllogism or demonstration to prove them. I take them, and for those of you who need some demonstrations, you may go back to classical books on philosophy and will find, lengthy discussions of philosophers. Now, for me, these are as pre-assumptions. Now, the application that Ibn Sina did not think about it, or perhaps Al-Farabi did not think it, but it is necessarily the implication of these two principles is this. let us apply these principles to the event of revelation. Because after all, revelation is something which happens in the world of nature. Prophets are human beings. Quran is adamant that prophets are human beings, because the people in the time of the prophet, as perhaps you have seen it in the Quran, one of their main objections against prophets was this, that who are their prophets? How come that they are prophets, but at the same time they are human beings? They eat, they sleep, they drink, they marry, this and that. But as you know, it is very explicit in the Quran that humanity has got such a huge capacity that can encompass prophethood as well. So the humanity is not too tight for prophethood. You can be at the same time a human being and a prophet. And there is no contradiction between humanity and prophethood. Eating, drinking, sleeping, and all these things can be, something that a prophet may do it without contradicting his prophethood. So prophets are human beings, and all what happens to them happens in the world of nature. So revelation, looking at it from the natural point of view, is a natural event. Absolutely natural. Now, let us apply the principle of everything that comes into that steps in the natural world is a natural event. So this is so far, well materialized. Now, as to the second thing, everything that happens in the world of nature is surrounded and conditioned by time and matter. This is exactly the idea of historicity. I mean, this is the jargon, we use it nowadays, but they did it in a different way, in a different formulation. But this is exactly the concept of historicity that we have it today. Everything that happens in this world of nature is historical, is surrounded and conditioned by time and matter. All right, if you accept this, then revelation is historical. Therefore, historicity of revelation, even if you believe in the supernatural nature of revelation, and that is my belief, but it does not contradict the historicity of revelation, because after all, revelation does not stay in the supernatural world, it comes down. You remember the analogy that Quran gives us for the revelation and many other things, which is a very apt analogy. Revelation is like raining. Rain comes from, let us say, heavens. It is unpolluted, uncontaminated when it is in clouds or in the heavens. But the moment that it falls on the ground, it becomes polluted, it becomes contaminated, and it cannot be helped. Therefore, on the ground, you will never have a pure water, always a contaminated water. You will have, by the same token, and by the same argument, let me say it boldly, you won't have a pure revelation on the earth, on the world of nature. It is always naturalized. It is always historicized. And because of this naturalization and historicization, it can become an object of scientific study, if you like. And we can make it the subject of our studies from the historical and natural point of view. This is my main argument in this book, and I have been, my time is up, and I have to wrap up what I have been saying. I hope I have been able to convey to you, clearly and lucidly what I had in mind, the argument that I put forward for it. Now, let me make perhaps the last point, and that is, you see that my main argument is, I come, again, from two people who are my heroes in my life, Rumi on the one hand, Al-Ghazali. For both of them, the essence of religion is spirituality, Therefore, I do not take the jurisprudence to be the essence of religiosity, theology, nothing of that sort. Every Sufi, every mystic person is a little prophet. And the grand prophets, of course, are grand Sufis. And in this way and in this sense, you can generalize prophethood. So everybody can have and can receive some revelation, some inspirations, let us say, from God and become a little prophet. Let us, a step further and go to, a little bit further to say that, Al-Ghazali in his book, The Deliverance from Error, there he tells us and gives us a very good example. He says that if somebody tells you that 3 is greater than 10, and at the same time he turns a piece of stick into a serpent, although you see the miracle, you should not believe in what he says. So the miracles and the force of miracles cannot and should not force you to believe in a contradiction. Therefore, miracles have limited power in order to show the truthfulness of a prophet, of a claimer, whoever he is. And then Ghazali not only negates this, but then on the affirmative part, he gives us a method. He says, in order to understand whether your partner, your friend is a good mathematician, you have to be a mathematician yourself. Then you can recognize whether he is a good mathematician or not. In order to recognize and realize that your friend is a good physician, you have to know some biology and physiology and medicine. And that's how he tells us that in order for you to recognize and to realize that such and such a person is a true prophet, you have to be a prophet yourself, a little prophet. And that means that you have to have some mystical experiences in the world. Through that, you will be able to realize whether somebody is a true prophet or a false prophet. So do not base your faith or your belief on miracles, because the force of miracle is very limited. And according to Rumi, the miracles are just to combat against the enemies. It is not to prove any truth, any article of faith, any principles whatsoever. So here is the main conclusion, that not only prophethood is generalizable, but it is necessary in order for the believers to have a full proof for the prophethood of a particular prophet. Just as a matter of conclusion, I would like to say that on the basis of what I said and on the basis of the historicity of religion and the language of religion and the mission of religion and the scripture itself, I have argued in the book that the whole law, Islamic law, the whole Islamic law, from top to bottom, is accidental, is historical, in the sense that it could have been absolutely different. It doesn't mean that we do not need any jurisprudence, but we have to realize that it was contingent upon the historical situation in the Arabia of the time of the Prophet and could have been absolutely different. Therefore, ijtihad takes an absolutely new sense, a new meaning, and a new direction if we base ourselves on the idea of the expansion of prophetic experience. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I am not going to make further expansion on my theory unless I receive some valuable comments on your part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Soroush. Now, Professor Andrew Ripin, he's going to raise some questions and having some comments, and then the conversation would continue, and then we will open the panel floor for your question. Professor Ripin.
Thanks. It's a great honor for me to be sitting here next to Professor Soroush, someone who we must all admire in all sorts of ways. And I know that the audience has certainly not come to hear me talk, but to hear Professor Soroush talk. And I do see my role as one of trying to ask some questions which come to my mind and so forth. But I've given a fair bit of thought, actually, to why it is I am even here. what position do I have in order to, in a sense, interrogate Professor Soroush on any particular issue which he has raised? I'm not a philosopher by any means. I would rather call myself a historian. I'm certainly not a Muslim reformer. I don't wish to be a prophet of any sort.
You can be.
And I'm certainly in no position to challenge the metaphysical assumptions of Professor Soroush's argument. What I am interested in, of course, and both interested in it and occasionally write on it, is the way in which contemporary Muslim intellectuals interact with the Quran, how they go about interpreting the Quran, and obviously that's then of great interest to me, and in many things as well, I guess, especially what you've just said now, but what were implicit in the book, always take me back to Asbab al-Nuzul. The classical Muslim thought really is in some senses wanting to argue for that contingent nature of revelation. It never gets quite enunciated in that full sense in which you put it, certainly. There was the one sort of issue I did want to raise is, in a certain sense, you've already raised it, and but there's a number of angles to it, and it all relates to, okay, so what am I doing here talking to you? And that is one approach to this particular question is a broad one, and you did answer it to some extent, but just to pursue it a bit further. What role do secular scholars such as myself have in, put it in a number of ways, have in informing your understanding of Islam, for one, I think is one question. Within the terminology of the book, it's, do scholars have roles that are useful, one might sense, in determining the accidentals of religion, the contingent elements of religion? Can we do that? Can we do that responsibly as scholars without becoming a part of what is ultimately an internal Muslim debate over reform? And that, in a certain sense, is the dilemma in which this leaves me. But I wonder if you have any comments on that sort of theme.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Professor Ripin. As to the Asbab al-Nuzul, actually, you mentioned a very important point. It shows, and I think you had in mind, that to some extent what I say is a continuation of what has been already there, although they have not theorized it, they have not formulated the same way that I do it, perhaps, and they have not generalized it in the way that I do. But nevertheless, the mindset, the perception has been always there, that for every verse, perhaps, there has been an Asbab al-Nuzul, the occasion of the revelation, why the verse has been revealed to the Prophet. And from here, actually, I took and I got the idea of the contingency and accidentality in the text, as I will come to explain it. So Asbab al-Nuzul, yes, is, although, I mean, there is a big difference and disagreement among commentators and mufassirun as to the validity and authenticity of Asbab al-Nuzul, and some have argued that most of them are post hoc, in the sense that they have been fabricated, later on, after the Quran was revealed to the Prophet, in order to make sense of the, scattered verses in the Quran, which are not usually in a good sequence, not in a good order, and, textualizing them sometimes, prove very difficult. So, like many other rawayat, Asbab al-Nuzul have been, some of them at least, made up for a particular purpose. They are ad hoc in a sense. But nevertheless, the idea has been there, of course. And it is very well known and very well received wisdom among Muslims that the whole book, I mean, the Quran was not like, let us say, 10 Commandments of Moses. it just was revealed to him. It was shaped and pre-formed, and just Moses was the receiver of the Ten Commandments. It was not like this. Quran itself is a historical book in the sense that it was compiled and it was, constituted within 23 years, revealed, bit by bit to the Prophet. And every bit has got its own reason, its own condition. And this is what usually is called Asbab al-Nuzul. But what is usually forgotten, what is usually ignored, is that this Asbab al-Nuzul has got not only some relevance to the issue that is revealed to the Prophet, but in a sense they caused the revelation. And this idea, this concept of causality here is a very crucial one. What I argue for is this, that it was not the case that even if those events did not happen, still the verses would have been revealed to the Prophet. That is not the case. Because contrary to some people, even Al-Ghazali, Quran did not have a pre-existent, being in the Arsh, in the Law, and some other supernatural places. It was revealed to the Prophet, and the revelation was formed and emerged and came to existence exactly because of the event that happened in the world of nature. Therefore, nature has got, if you like, some causality relationship with the supernatural. And it causes, it is not always subordinate to the supernatural. Sometimes it forces the supernatural to do something, to respond and to react. It is like, we have got some other concepts in religion like prayers. You pray something to God and you cause, the answering of God. So it is not an alien, concept altogether. You cause supernatural world to answer to you, to respond, to react, So this is how I think about it and I understand it. Therefore, Asbab al-Nuzul has been always there. Many books written about it and scattered places in commentaries on the Quran. You find them. But the full interpretation of the idea of Asbab al-Nuzul, the full interpretation of it has not been yet there. And I think you can, take it and interpret it in the way that I do it. I would like to add, something to this particular question, and that is Waliullah Dehlavi, who lived in 18th century India, and perhaps he was the pioneer and the first person not only to look into the Asbab al-Nuzul, but also on the sociology of the, Arabia, of the sociology and psychology of the Arab people of the time of the Prophet. He's very explicit on that. He was a jurist. He was a Sufi. He was one of the mashayikh. There is no single doubt in his sincerity from the point of view of being a true believer. But nevertheless, his interpretation and his explanation of the event, of the phenomenon of revelation is quite interesting. What he says is this, that even the psychology of the Arab people was relevant to the revelation. If they were different, if their psyche were different, the revelation which came to the Prophet would have been different, And this also has got its own ground and basis in the Quran itself. When it says, لَا يُكَلِّفُ اللَّهُ نَفْسًا إِلَّا وَسْعَهَا, the duties and obligations are tailored to the ability of people. So if we were, more able, the duties would have become heavier. Instead of praying 17 rak'at 5 times a day, we would have been, duty bound and forced to perhaps pray 50 times a day. So even the obligations, and this shows the historicity of revelation. Historicity in the sense that it is absolutely conditioned with the ability, with the social conditions, psychological conditions of the people that the revelation addressed them at first. And then, of course, then we have to translate it into our cultural situation nowadays and so on. So this is the idea of Asbab al-Nuzul. But coming to the perhaps more important question, the role of secular students of Quran, yes, in informing the ideas of reformers, or perhaps in determining what are contingent and what are not contingent or necessary in the Quran. The role is great, is huge, is important. And I, before I come to that, I have to just say a few words about the contingent and the necessary. This is, again, one of the articles, one of the chapters in the book. There are argue that in every book, and especially in scriptures, in the holy books, not everything is on a par with another one. Not everything is on the same footing. There are differences among the different verses of the Quran. Let us say some are more important than others. It is against the common wisdom about the scripture. They think that since all come from God, then they have come all the same value, the same essence, the same importance, and everything. But that is not the case. At least in the past, our commentators and mufassirin had argued that from the point of view of eloquence, some of the verses are much more eloquent than others. This, you find it in the, commentaries of Muslim commentators in the past. And that came to them as a very, very plausible, acceptable position. And some of them actually were, masters in ilm al-balagha. And therefore, for them, it was quite valid to make such a judgment. So there is an unevenness, in the verses of the Quran, no doubt about it, at least from the point of view of eloquence. But it is not only, from this point. There are many other points of view that you can bring in, and you can further your knowledge, your analysis of the text. And this applies not only to the Quran, but to any text, any scripture, any holy book. But here, of course, the object of study is Quran. Quran itself tells us that there are verses which are muhkamat and there are verses which are mutashabahat, the clear ones and the unclear ones. Okay, to simplify it. So this is, first of all, one of the divisions and categorizations that already you can find in the Quran. And now, what I suggest is this, that you can make a new division among the verses of the Quran. Some are accidental or contingent, if you like, and some are necessary or essential. So this is something that I have suggested. I think if we believe in the historicity of the Quran, this comes again as almost a tautology, a self-evident idea. Let me give you some examples in order to substantiate the idea. The Prophet Muhammad had many enemies, and there are some verses in the Quran that mention has been made of some of the enemies, even by name. One of them is Abu Lahab, who was the uncle of the Prophet, and he is cursed in the Quran, one of the very well-known Meccan surahs towards the end of the Quran. Tabbat yada Abi Lahabin wa tab. Now, I consider this whole surah as accidental. If there were no Abu Lahab in the world, or if he were there, but he was not among the adversaries and enemies of the Prophet, he was a simple believer, no mention of him would have come in the Quran. Yes? The wife of the Prophet, Aisha, was accused of adultery. The story is well known, and the story is in the Quran, in Surah An-Nur. Now, of course, this accusation had its own reasons. Perhaps some of the enemies of the Prophet wanted, perhaps to do, to accuse him. So anyway, this was the accusation. And you have got the full story of this accusation in the Quran. If the enemies of Prophet did not make such an accusation against the Prophet's wife, a whole number of verses would not have been in the Quran now. They were revealed only because of the accusation that some people made. against Aisha. Isn't it the case? The Prophet Muhammad fought many battles against his enemies, or they fought against him, whatever. And the mention of some of these battles are there in the Quran. If those battles were not fought, then the mention would not have been in the Quran. All these are accidental in the sense that they have been the accident of history, contingent phenomena of history. And for some reasons, they are now being mentioned and used in the Quran, but it could have been absolutely different in the sense that the Quran could have been, without them. I go even further than this, that had Prophet lived more than he lived, he was 63 when he died, when he passed away. Let us think that perhaps if he lived longer, if he lived for 100 years, I think the Quran would have become much longer than this. Perhaps the second volume would come. Because after all, because Quran followed the path of the Prophet, followed the life of the Prophet to the extent that he lived, and he created, conditions upon conditions, and he, had more fightings, had more, questions coming to him, asking him, different questions, and the answers in the Quran. Therefore, no wonder if somebody says that it was not predestined, from eternity, that the Quran should and necessarily should be one volume. It could have become 2 volumes. It could have become 3 volumes, and so on and so forth. This is the real meaning of the historicity, historicality, and contingency of the Quran, and the meaning that the supernatural, when steps in the natural world, become naturalized. And when it becomes naturalized, all characteristics of a natural event, a natural phenomena applies to it without exception. So this is the meaning of the contingent and essential beings. So most of what you have in the Quran are accidentals. Most of what you have in the Quran are accidentals. And the essential ones are very few. Actually, this is the meaning of a minimalistic religion. Most of what you find in the book are contingent things, which could have been different. They could have been otherwise. Therefore, the minimalistic religion is the essentials of religion, and the essentials are very few indeed. And a true belief is belief not in the accidents, but in the essentials. So this is how things go, and you can make implications upon implications. Now, what are the role of the secular students of Quran? It is immense. Actually, some of the contingent things that I have mentioned in my book, I would say that perhaps I have taken it from the secular students of the Quran, because they have been so keen on the historical conditions of the revelation of the Quran, that they have shown us that in such and such an anthropological situation, a geographical situation, psychological situation, and so on and so forth, the revelation has been conditioned in a particular way. So from that point of view, yes, of course, it is not for the secular ones to tell us what are the essentials of a religion. Perhaps it is for the believers to know and to, to understand what are the essentials. But as to the contingent part, as to the historical ones, the historical studies of the secular students, the secular scholars of Quran can help a lot. And this is something that I always, recommend my fellow, students of Quran to take into consideration. That alone, again, Quran is too important to be left to believers only. It's too important to be left to lovers only. So we need some scholars who are detached and who look at the Quran from a different point of view, from different perspectives. And when all they come together, our understanding of Quran will become brighter and better. I hope I have been...
May I ask one more question? And it'll be a brief question and a brief answer so that we can have the audience. But after telling me that, and talking about the essentials in the Quran and so forth, I start to wonder, about what Islam is, or how you position yourself as a Muslim. So are those essentials within the Quran what provide the definition of a Muslim? Or are they universals? In fact, are they metaphysical universals which are left there? In which case, then, do you identify yourself as a Muslim, I suppose would be the question to pose.
Well, I think, yes, I identify myself as a Muslim, and as I mentioned, and I did no hesitation to mention it, that the Prophet Muhammad is not only an object of belief, but also an object of love for me. Therefore, yes, indeed. And absolutely, as I mentioned, just a moment ago, belief means believing in the essentials. The accidentals are accidentals, and they could have been different, as I said it many times. Now, essentials of a religion, let me give you some examples. For example, the idea of Tawheed, the unity of God. I think this is one of the essentials of the religion, of Islam at least. And without it, and without believing in the unity of God, you cannot be considered as a Muslim. Or the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad is one of the essentials, because without it, nobody can be, considered as a true Muslim. He may be a Unitarian. He may be a person who believes in the existence of God, but without believing in the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad, he cannot be considered as a Muslim, because that is one of the pillars of, being a Muslim. And of course, the idea of resurrection, that also comes and is one of the essentials. Let me give you more examples. You are familiar with the idea of maqasid, the goals of Sharia. Why Sharia is there, why we have got Islamic laws, why we have got jurisprudence, and so on. So as I said, all fiqh, all jurisprudence is contingent. They could have been, all the precepts of Sharia could have been different. But the maqasid, i.e. the aims of Sharia, they are essential. Because the whole law of Sharia is there in order to protect your faith, protect your life, protect your religion, and so on and so forth. And this has been done, for about 10 centuries now. The Juwayni, the teacher of Al-Ghazali, and Ghazali himself, and best of all by Shatibi, actually, all this has been discussed very extensively, that there are aims, behind the precepts of Sharia, of law. Those can be considered as essentials. But of course, we are in the process of theorizing about essentials and contingent ones. So we may differ. Something you might say that it is essential, and I might, might disagree. Just to give you an anecdote from the late Nasr Abu Zaid. Some 5-6 years ago, we had a discussion in a closed meeting in Germany. We were, only 3. 2 of them now are dead, unfortunately, Muhammad Arkoun and Nasr Abu Zaid and me. So we were discussing this idea of contingency and the essential ones. Professor Nasr actually disagreed very vehemently with me on one of the instances, and that was the Arabic language. I told him that the Arabic language is contingent, is accidental to Islam. If the Prophet Muhammad were born, let us say in Germany, in Greece, the language of Islam would have become Greek. The language of Islam would have become German. So therefore it is contingent, and it is a limitation, because the Prophet Muhammad, or perhaps God, was somehow forced to reveal what he had in mind in Arabic. Perhaps if he had Greek language at his disposal, he would have much greater space in order to express himself. So this is another limitation, and this is a contingent factor in religion, all religions. For Jesus, for example, Aramaic language, or Syriac, and so on and so forth. In every religion, language is the contingent, the accidental factor. But Professor Nasr actually did not agree, and he thought that it was one of the essential points in in Islam. So disagreements can be there.
Thank you very much. Before we open the floor to the audience, I want to take advantage of my position and I ask a question. You discussed about the historicity of the book, the scripture. But to my understanding, when we talk about revelation, we can talk about revelation at least in 3 different levels: the source of revelation, the process of revelation, and the outcome. And the historicity you mentioned refers to the outcome. Now, it seems to me the notion of historicity, from your perspective, goes much, much deeper. And at some point, if I recall it correctly, you mentioned that the Quran is the words of Muhammad himself. Would you please elaborate on that concept?
Well, yes. I mean, as I said, I mean, the implications of the theory of the naturalization of or secularization of revelation, if you like, is much deeper. And as Professor Naraqi mentioned, not only the outcome of the revelation is historical, i.e. the Quran or the scripture historical, but also, let us say, the process is historical and natural, in the sense that Muhammad was the mouthpiece of God. You can put it in mystical terms, that he was so close to God that whatever he said, actually you can consider it as the voice or the word of God. So this means that the union, I wrote to one of the grand ayatollahs in Iran who actually criticized my ideas, and I told him that your metaphysics is the metaphysics of separation, my metaphysics is the metaphysics of union. And still I stick to that. I mean, usually we forget that even on the basis of the traditional classical metaphysics of Muslim philosophers, there is no gap whatsoever between God and his creatures. They are really, really one and the same. And this in the deepest sense of the word. And because of that, I take it that even from the traditional point of view, you may say that the Prophet was so close to God and so united with him and so engaged with him and so dissolved in him. And all these are mystical conceptualizations, and it is already there in the mystical tradition and literature. So engaged and so dissolved in him that there was no separation between the two. Whatever Prophet Muhammad said from his human position can be considered as divine, and that is the real meaning of prophethood, actually. The prophethood is not, the meaning of the prophethood is not this, that I sit here and somebody or an angel, something comes to me and tells me something, and I, return it to you. That is not the case. I have to become prophet in the sense that I have to occupy a position that my words are God's words. So this is the real prophethood. And this was that, the position or perhaps the bounty that God had given all prophets, not only the Prophet of Islam. And that's why actually another implication of this, that virtually there is not much difference between the Quran and other sayings of the Prophet. They are virtually one and the same. The authentic saying of the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran are more or less on the same footing. And we consider them, as the same, with the same reverence, with the same seriousness, and with the same importance. So although part of it is called Quran and the part of it are not called Quran, but from the point of view of historical understanding and new explanation of revelation, we can consider them all as a unique and monotonous fabric without much difference between them. This is another implication of this theory.
Thank you. And now times for questions. If I may, would you please, if you have any question, come to the front and use the microphone, and please introduce yourself before you ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Omid Safi from University of North Carolina. Thank you again, Ustad, for being here, and we're so looking forward to having you back again. I will keep my questions short and sweet. Hope other people will as well, so that we have more chance to hear from you. So I have a brief two-part question. You spoke of your own position as a British empiricist, even though you're also drawing on the philosophical tradition, the mystical tradition. I would love to hear a little more about the way in which the mystical tradition in particular, Maulana being prominent among them, has helped shape this understanding of prophethood as you have defined it. And the second part of the question is actually a philosophical exercise, but with a very real political relevance. You spoke about the ways in which, had the Prophet been born in Greece and he would have spoken Greek, how it would have shaped the Quran differently, and so forth. I'm wondering if we can apply that same historicity to the turbulent and difficult situation that you have been in and have paid an incredible price for. Had you not been in a situation where the state operates through the most brutal and oppressive apparatus, and we're instead living in a situation, a hypothetical situation, where the state is not involved in implementing a specific understanding of religion, would you feel the same urgency to historicize and minimize the practice of religion? Thank you, Ustad.
Okay. Shall I?
Please go ahead.
Well, as to the first question, I thought that perhaps you are going to ask me how I reconcile between being a British empiricist and at the same time, and having mystical ideas on the other, and how these two are compatible. But thank God you did not ask me that very difficult and hard question. Rather, you were so tender and kind to ask me a much more lovable. Well, of course, I mean, you are right, absolutely right. Rumi has been very, very helpful and very, influential in my thinking. And as I said, I mean, everybody is a little prophet. This is exactly what I have taken from Rumi. Rumi uses this, and he tells us, in a number of places. Actually, he bases his argument on the Quran, because as you know, in the Quran, revelation is used not only for human beings, but for bees, for animals, for even earth, for the mother of Moses. So in all cases, you have got the concept of revelation. Therefore, not only human beings can be subject of revelation, but many other things. And Rumi actually tells us that if bees can receive revelation from God, you as a human being are much more superior than bees. So you deserve also to receive revelation from God. Therefore, and he mentions it in a number of verses of poems in his Masnavi especially. In the Quran, of course, there is a mention of bees who receive revelation from God, and because of the revelation that they receive, they make honey. This is very important, and for Rumi, it is full of meaning, full of implications. He adds to it the silkworm. This is not in the Quran, but by the same token, he thinks that he can add. He said the silkworm also received revelation from God, and through that revelation, he makes silk. So if that is the case, and if you or an animal or a bee or an insect can receive revelation and produce honey and silk, we human beings also can receive revelation and produce commodities which are much more valuable than honey and silk and so on and so forth, i.e. intellectual products. This is and mystical products, spiritual products. This is what Rumi actually teaches us, and I have taken this idea from him and many others, But as I said, in order for us to understand prophethood, rather than going to philosophers, we have to go to mystics. Because they are semi-prophets, they are little prophets. They understand mystical experience. They understand prophethood much better than, a peripatetic like Ibn Sina, who used only his intellect in order to understand the world. Even Rumi says that Ghazali was, the greatest thinker of the world, but alas, he lacked love. Therefore, in order to be a good mystic, not only you have to be a great thinker, but also you have to experience love. And by love, he means divine love. Therefore, people who experience love and fear, and of course have got a great intellectual capacity, they can, understand, the essence of prophethood and mysticism and tell us about it. And Rumi actually did so. And through him, I came to learn a lot of, things, and I am really, really grateful to him. And my ideas about this is shaped by him. And I tell you, before my adversaries and in front of them, usually when I want to defend myself, I have got my arguments, but I invoke Rumi, because he's a very, very good, a castle that I, refuge to it in order to protect myself. His ideas are so respectable among all Muslims, Shi'is and Sunnis, and his, argument is so forceful that you cannot help, accepting it. Coming to the second question, well, I am a human being, I am historical, and all what I do and all what I say are historicized. I mean, prophets are no exception. I mean, I am nothing. Therefore, yes, I can say that perhaps if I were living in a different country, under a different political condition, my ideas about religion, about revelation would have become different. Or perhaps I never came, to think, so, urgently about religion. Maybe I directed, my intellectual faculty towards some other more urgent questions. But in Iran, since politics and religion are one and the same, at least according to the rulers, when you come to politics, eventually and necessarily, you will go to politics. And if you go to politics, eventually it will lead you to religion. So from any end, you will, will lead to the other end. And since I am both interested in religion and politics, and therefore, in order to reform politics, I thought that perhaps the reform in religion is incumbent, is mandatory. That is the case in Iran. Maybe it is not the case in America. Maybe it's not the case, I don't know, in some other places. But at least as far as I understand in Iran, in order to be a religious reform, in order to be a political reformer, you have to be a religious reformer. And the moment that you become a religious reformer, the politics, inevitably will be influenced by your ideas in religion. That's the way that, I approach, both religion and politics.
Yes, sir, please.
Thank you for all your inspiring work. I'm Mark Berkson from Hamline University. I just want to follow up on your statement that all of us can be little prophets in the sense of having these spiritual experiences, receiving revelation. You often qualify the word prophet, though, with little in that sense. So if I can ask you to clarify two distinctions. One, the difference between maybe little prophet and perhaps big prophet, the prophets maybe who appear in the Quran, named and unnamed, and the other between prophet and messenger, Nabi, Rasul. And I'm wondering, is there any sense in which Muhammad can be seen as a seal, as they say, seal of the prophets, a last one? So perhaps we little prophets won't necessarily receive some kind of oral or written revelation that can then become a text or something. Is that in the sense, is that in that sense final? Because if not, and it's an ongoing revelation in another sense, is that quite sort of more similar to maybe what the Baha'i sense of ongoing revelation is? And how would your sense be distinct from that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, are you happy that we can be little prophets, or perhaps it's too scary? But anyway, let me, explain this. No, I say little prophets just in order to make, my position as acceptable as, possible. But there is no difference between a little prophet or a grand prophet, because prophethood is there anyway. And if you claim that prophethood is possible for everybody, it doesn't matter whether you are a little one or a great one or whatever. But I think I mentioned it, but I clarify it more here. that prophets and the difference between prophets and Sufis or mystics is this, as far as I understand, that prophets are mystics with a mission, but mystics are prophets without mission. Okay, so this is the main thing, the main difference between the two. If you want to draw the line of demarcation between the two, for example, we have got Rumi, he was a great mystic. We have got Ibn Arabi, a great mystic, Al-Ghazali, and many others. Some of them very knowledgeable person, apart from being a mystic, apart from having spiritual experiences and so on. They were great thinker, they were great knowledgeable person, but they never claimed to be prophet, and they did not, have missions for themselves. And nobody actually came to consider them as having a mission, following them. So this is mysticism. But once you have a spiritual experience plus a mission and declare it to others and fight for it and have some certainty about it and so on and so forth. So this is prophethood. I am not arguing for the truthfulness or otherwise of these prophets. I'm just looking at them from the outside. All prophets, false or no false or true, they are like this. They first of all claim that they have got experiences, a spiritual one, transcendental experiences, and then they have got missions and invite people to follow them. This is the difference between the two. Now, when I say that the prophethood is generalizable and expandable, and there can be prophets in the contemporary age, it means that mysticism is an ongoing thing. A spiritual experience is ongoing, is not limited to any age or any generation, any person, any part of the world, and so on. So this is something which is going on, and in that sense I say that they are little prophets because they have no mission. Now, the Prophet Muhammad, of course, was both a prophet and a passenger. He was a Nabi and he was a Rasul. This, demarcation, distinction is not a very sharp one. Both, words, are there in the Quran, and some have said that perhaps Nabi is somebody who has only who has received revelation, like mystics, as I mentioned. But Rasul is somebody who has got the spiritual experience as well as the mission. Now, coming to the more difficult question, that if revelation is expandable, if everybody can receive revelation, so what is the meaning of the Prophet Muhammad being the seal of prophets, the final prophet? I understand this. Now, my answer is this, that this is an inter-religious claim. It's not an extra one. It is only for Muslims. It means it is a normative thing. It is not descriptive, in the sense that I, as a Muslim, will never pay attention to anybody who claims prophethood after Prophet Muhammad. And I say, because he said that there will be no prophet anymore, so please do not listen to anybody else. So long as I'm a Muslim, so long as I am a Muslim, I stick by that rule, and I will not pay attention to anybody else. But for someone else who is not a Muslim, there will be no such normativity. He can, be open to any other prophethood, and he can think that, there might come some, more prophets with mission, with spiritual experiences, with books, and things, so on. This is there. I mean, the same question and answer, by the way, is in the book. And my answer is exactly the way I have put it in the book.
If you don't mind, we take more than one question, sure, because we have a limited time, and you answer them all together if it's possible.
Please
right. Go ahead.
Two questions.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Hi, my name is Joseph Thomason. I'm a graduate student at Arizona State University. I've heard you touch upon Quran and Hadith as sources for the historicity of the Prophet. I wanted you to comment on how you use the seerah in your method for kind of approaching historical Muhammad.
Well, seerah...
Professor Soroush,
yeah.
Would you pause for a second,
sure,
and we
okay,
get the second question?
Özgür Koca from Karim Graduate University. Dr. Soroush, you emphasized the role of mystical experience in practicing religion, but it seems like mystical experience seems to be a privilege of a minority. Do you think then your understanding of religion may lead to a highly elite interpretation? And so that may lose relevance for a larger part of religious public?
Okay.
If you don't mind, let's take a
Another
last
one?
question.
Okay.
This gentleman was waiting for a long time. Please go ahead.
Yeah, James Kraft. So I'm wondering how you resolve the disagreements. You talked about a disagreement with another scholar, Nash, I think was the name, over whether Arabic is essential
Nash,
or accidental. So how do you decide what is the essential message of Islam? So then, do you feel less confidence in your approach when you meet up with somebody who is highly intelligent and has a different opinion about the matter? So what kind of strategies, methods do you use in order to support your claim that Arabic is not essential, or that the Tawheed is essential? So is it just a matter of intuition, or is it something more? So your opponent says, hey, I've prayed a lot about this, thought a lot about it, and I believe the opposite of what you believe about what's essential to Islam. How do you resolve these kind of conflicts?
Well, okay, as to the first question, the Sirah and the place of Sirah in my studies. Well, I mean, Sirah is part of history. You know, it's written some 150 years after the life of the Prophet. So, you know, you can have your doubts, your analysis, your whatever, I mean, about the Sirah. Of course, it is not the only book, Sirat ibn Husham, I mean, that is written about the Prophet, but more or less most of the books, or perhaps all of them that has been written about the biography of the Prophet Muhammad are at least as late as 100 years after him. So we have to be very, very cautious about using both hadith and Sirah. And here also we have to take a very minimalist approach, you know, and only the essentials, those parts which are, you know, absolutely certain or more plausible, and taken, you know, with other, you know, historical evidence, such as geographical and things, tablets which come to us, you know, on stone and so on. All this, which again, here comes the students of Quran from the Western culture, who has done a lot on these parts of the historical studies, and we are grateful to them. This actually is something that we have to take into account. By far, actually, the Quran itself is the most important and the most reliable source for the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Others, I mean, all other sources should be collated and compared with the Quran itself. Otherwise, maybe we go astray. So this is but as to the hadith, actually, I tell you my position. All hadiths are false unless otherwise proved. You know, this is my position, because there are so many hadiths, false hadiths in Islam, that we better take the assumption that all of them has been forged and fabricated by, you know, people who had some interest, you know, in forging those hadiths. And unless we can prove them to be authentic and valid. And this is a great task, as you know. Now, the elitist view of religion, well, it is not the case. I mean, of course, let me tell you, I mean, religious or spiritual experience is like intellect. Intellect, of course, we have got higher levels of intellect and intellectuality, like what you find in philosophers and mathematicians and so on. But it doesn't mean that ordinary people lack intellect. They do, because intellect is a matter of degrees. You know, I have got a degree of intellect, you have, and others and others. It is exactly like a spiritual experience. Higher stations of spirituality, of course, can be found, you know, with people like Rumi and others. But every one of us can have some religious experience. And to that extent that we have got access to the sacred, you know, we can be really, you know, considered as a true religious person. Following the Prophet is different from sharing the experience of the Prophet. These are two different things. Rumi and Al-Ghazali actually invite us not only to follow the Prophet in what he says and in what he enjoys or in what he prohibits us to do and so on. That is the lowest rank, the lowest, you know, level, lowest order of, you know, being a believer. No, you have got higher orders, and that higher orders is to share the experience of the Prophet. And this is something that every religious person should try, to reach and to do and to share. So it is not an elitist, position. It says that, of course, it is a ladder. You can go up and up and up, higher and higher and higher, but still, on the lowest order of the ladder, you are on the ladder anyway. And this is not an elitist view of religiosity, but of course religiosity, as our mystics have said, it has got a shell, it has got a kernel. Some people have got only the shell, but the kernel is much more important. This has been always the case, and Sufis have mentioned this, and of course there are in the sayings of the Prophet, you can find something to that effect. Now coming to conflict resolution that you asked. Well, the disagreement can never be resolved, but I have got my own method. Mine and Professor Nasr Abu Zaid, yes, we did not have enough time, to continue our discussion and perhaps to resolve this disagreement. But I think I am, very confident that my position as to the contingency and accidentality of religion in all, of language in all religions is a very, well-grounded and well-established and defensible position, no doubt about it. Because, my method is this, that it is like peeling off, something that you have, and you, question it. Could it have been different? And through that questioning, you will come to the conclusion whether the object you have got at hand is an accident or is an essential one. Could Islam be Islam without the idea of Tawheed? It cannot be, because the idea of Tawheed is a main pillar, the main pillar. If you study the book, Quran, if you go to the sayings of the Prophet, to the practice of Muslims, and wherever you go, this is one thing that you will never miss it. Everybody accept it as the pillar. But could, the language of religion be different? If the Prophet were a Persian, let us say. No doubt, because God had different prophets with different languages. So the language cannot be an essential part of, and as you see, for example, even in the Quran, some of the commentators in the past thought that perhaps Quran is purely Arabic. But now we know, again, through the efforts of secular students of Quran, that about 240, 250 words are in the Quran which are non-Arabic. You see, and that was, prevalent in the time of the Prophet among the Arabs, through their, communication with other people and other nations. Greek, Persian, there are so many Persian words in the Quran, Greek, Abyssinian, Aramaic, and so on and so forth. So, it is something which is quite, easily conceivable, that if the Prophet were born in a different place, in a different society, the language would have become different. Not only the language, because language is, has got a form and a content. The language of Greek philosophy is a very rich language. And if that language were accessible to Prophet Muhammad, his language, the language of Quran, I think would have become much richer, much more philosophical. It is not only the words that could, find their way in the scripture, but also the concepts, the meanings. And from that point of view, the contingency goes deep, not only in the precepts and in the, law and Sharia, goes deep into the meanings and into the, theological positions and standpoints of Prophet Muhammad. But that is inevitable, because everything in the world of nature is naturalized. If Prophet Muhammad were born in Greece and his Quran would become, and of course at that time it would not have been called Quran, a different name, and become Greek, the conceptualization of what he wanted to tell us would become different. But then, of course, again, it was a limitation, the Greek language, because compared, let us say, with Persian, Persian is a very poetical language. Maybe it would have given him a much better space to maneuver and to, convey to us, his ideas. So this is exactly the meaning of whatever you have in this nature is naturalized. Be it the revelation, the spirit of human beings, or whatever you like, you name it.
Okay, I wish we had more time to continue this conversation. Unfortunately, time is up. Thank you, Dr. Soroush. Thank you, Dr. Ripin. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good evening.